Welcome. Today is the 12th of Cheshvan, the 13th of November. And we actually finished the Partzuf, the model that we wanted to discuss from this week's wonders. I just wanted to mention one more thing about that. And if you remember all the words, the 6 permutations of the letters Chet, Lamed, and Mem that we saw yesterday, so interestingly, almost all of them appear in this week's Parsha, and something I just noticed this morning. So we have the let's look at the well, we can't look at it, but you'll take my word for it. The different permutations that we saw. So we had, if you remember, these 3 letters. So we said the Mem is the wisdom, the Lamed is the understanding, the Chet is the Chokhmah, the knowledge. And so the first permutation is Mem Lamed Chet, which spells Melach. Melach is salt. And who is more famous for being salt than Lot's wife, who turned into a pillar of salt? And that appears in this week's Parsha. The word salt is not very common in the Torah. In fact, it's very rare. So we have this other permutation. If you remember, we began with the word chamal, that God had pity on Lot. We said that that's the permutation that corresponds to beauty, to the sphere of beauty, sphere of Tiferet, and it also is, in its interior experience, it's one of compassion. So we had, that's what we started with. Now we see that we have the Chesed, the Melach. Then, interestingly, we also have the Yesod. The Yesod is also here. The first dream that is openly a dream is in this week's Parsha, in this week's Torah portion. And it's the dream that Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, has. And that, we said, corresponds to Yesod, to foundation. That's Chalam. Now, we also have the bread. The bread doesn't appear explicitly. The bread is what is the Lamed Chet Mem, Lechem. And that corresponds to Gevura, to might. That's how we set it up. And it appears when Lot brings the angels into his house. So it doesn't say explicitly what he gave them to eat, but apparently it was bread. The final one is machal. We said lamed mem chet doesn't appear because it's not a root of any Hebrew words, but machal mem chet lamed, which corresponds to victory. So where is that in our parsha? So again, it doesn't appear as a word explicitly, but Lot asks God to allow him to escape to one of the 5 cities of the plain. Sodom and Gomorrah were 2 of them. Then there was another one that was a little bit younger than those 2. It had been built a little later. Its name was Tzoar. And because Lot asked to be allowed to go there, to that city, and be saved there, the whole city was saved. And that's Mechila. Mechila means to forgive. In that sense, God forgave Lot, and he also forgave the entire city. So here we have this this whole structure that we talked about, which appears 3 of them explicitly, 2 of them implicitly in this week's Torah portion. Now, I really wanted to start the second Partzuf, a second model, but I decided to save that one for later because it fits in different places, and we already put out the Wonders magazine for this week, so we just learned the one we did. What I thought we'd do with the rest of the time that we don't have much more time. We have today and tomorrow, half the time tomorrow, a few minutes, and a little bit tomorrow, is to go a little bit more in depth into one idea in the Parsha. And this doesn't appear explicitly in Wonders, and let's look at it. It's an idea that we've been talking about in the morning classes of God needing to come down, as it were, to see the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, to see their conduct. Erdana ve'ere haketsa'akata haba elai. I will go down and see, is it like the cry that is coming to me? So there's so many questions about this. The major one that we've been dealing with in the morning is, how can you say that God has to do something in order to know something? He wants to go down in order to see, is the cry that I'm receiving really what's going on down there? So what do you mean? God knows everything. He is omniscient. And by definition, he's omniscient. So what possible action does he need to take in order to find out something? But if you listen to these words a little bit carefully, you'll see that there's another problem in them. What do you mean by the cry that's being brought to me? Who's bringing this cry to you? Haketsagata haba elai. The cry is coming to me. Who's bringing it to you? Why does it even need to be brought to you? If God is omniscient, he should know without it being heard, as it were, traveling from where it is to. So obviously these are images, and we have to unpack these images. So these images all have to do with God's omniscience, and what does that exactly mean? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Alter Rebbe's short but very insightful essay on this. And this essay appears in Torah Or, which is his main volume of essays. And it's on page 28, or 14, folio 14, side D. And we're not going to have a chance to do everything, but we'll at least get a gist of it. We'll at least get some of it in. And if it's really very, very interesting to, and the comments section shows it, that we could continue doing this also next week after we finish the Partzuf next week, the model next week. So I would like to do it the same way that I always do, which is first to read in Hebrew, and then translate it, and then explain what there is to understand from this. So it begins with Erdana ve'gomer, Hinei haketsakata u'lashon nekeva v'chen haba'a. The first thing he says is, its cry. In Hebrew, words, nouns, have gender. So in this case, tza'aka is possessive, it's her cry, and her is feminine. So he says, this is a feminine cry. And the verb that follows, that is coming to me, the verb coming, is also in the feminine form. Ve'asu lashon nekeva ve'lashon zachar. And the verse there reads, is what they did, meaning Sodom and Gomorrah, their actions, that's already written in the masculine. So what is that about? Why the switch? And again, the question, what does it mean that God has to go down to see? He sees from above, he's omniscient. So the answer to these questions begins by understanding what this cry is about. Where is this cry coming from? So if you read Rashi on the verse, you'll see that Rashi is also troubled by why is it in the feminine. It should have been Haketza'akat Sdom ve'Amorah, which would have made it neutral, because it's the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah. But here it's like her cry. Who's she? Who is she talking about? So Rashi, in an attempt to explain this, he brings us a medrash, a homiletic interpretation, which tells the story of a little girl there who wanted to bring food to an old man who was very poor and didn't have anything. And when the officers of Sodom and Gomorrah caught her, and it was forbidden to give charity in Sodom and Gomorrah, they had her executed in a terrible way. How did they have her executed? They put honey all over her body, and they put her out for the bees to sting. Why that's the way it works, I have no idea. I don't think that bees sting you if you put honey on your body. That's the description. So who is her cry? the cry of this girl, of this young girl who was trying to give charity to an old man. But, says the Alter Rebbe, a different explanation. היינו הצעקה העולה מבחינת מידת הדין, שהיא בחינת מידת מלכות שנקרא דין, דינא דמלכותא דינא, רק שהיא דינא רפיא, מלך במשפט ימיד ארץ. So he says, here the feminine form of the cry is because it's coming from the measure of judgment of kingdom, the sphera of kingdom. There are two types of judgment in the world. There is the judgment that people judge others, and this is one of the 7 Noahide laws. It's a universal decree from God, commandment, for all of humanity to set up courts of law, because you can't run a society without having a just system. That is considered to be one form of judgment. The other form of judgment is the judgment that's built into the world. There is judgment that is built into the world. For instance, the judgment here he brings, an example of, is a king. And now, think about it this way, that the judgment that's built into the world, God is king, is more lenient than the judgment of people. Why? Because God is the master of compassion. And human beings cannot always take upon themselves to be compassionate. It depends on what the situation is. So, the example of this would be that when a president of the United States decides, he can pardon someone. How can he be so lenient as to pardon him? Because he has other considerations. And these are considerations that the founding fathers, the ones who wrote the Constitution, gave him power to act a little bit like God. And this is how the world works. The world works in such a way that there is justice that is administered by people, and there is the justice that's administered by God, and God's justice is much more compassionate and lenient than the justice in the world. And he does it because he knows the right way in which to sustain reality. And we who don't know exactly how to sustain reality have to judge more harshly in order to make sure that reality, civilization doesn't fall apart. So it's a luxury that we don't have. We'd like to have it, and sometimes when you have it too much, you actually cause the world to deteriorate. And we've talked about this in the past. This is one of the things that is it's part of the balance that has to be struck between the more lenient, let's call it the Democrats in America, the Democratic Party, and the more stringent, less lenient, more harsh Republican approach. And if you lean too much towards the leniency, the world begins to fall apart at the seams in a certain sense. Meaning there has to be some harshness in order to keep things going. Okay, so he says this. What is he talking about? What kind of judgment is there that's built into the world? His answer is like this. וביאור העניין, הנה מתחילה יש להקדים לשון השגור בדברי חז"ל גלוי וידוע לפני מי שאמר והיה העולם. To understand this, what do you mean that there is judgment built into the world? So you first of all have to understand what it means that God is omniscient. The idiom that the sages use is galui v'yadua lefanav. It is known, it is revealed to him. The way these words appear in Hebrew, it means that he doesn't come to know it, but rather it is, in and of itself, it is known to him. That is omniscience. Omniscience means that God doesn't have to do anything, like we understand. He doesn't have to do anything to know anything about reality. He and reality in this sense are the same. And as he knows himself, he knows reality. It's all the same. It's like in the same way that when everything is working in my mind, I don't have to do something special in order to know what I'm thinking or what I want to say. It's part of me. It's just how it is. I don't have to act. Now, as we know, there's challenges to everything philosophically and even physiologically today. So, in science today, it's not even accepted so much. Meaning that this would not be a good example, because when we come to think, we actually have to use our consciousness to direct our awareness towards our thoughts. And so we could argue that we don't really know ourselves. It takes introspection in order to know ourselves. But when it comes to God, He knows without doing anything. That is omniscience. And that's why it's called גלוי וידוע דייקה. כי הנה הפילוסופים נלאו להשיג עניין ההשגחה הפרטית, כמו אין אדם נוקף אצבעו מלמטה, אלא אם כן מחזין עליו מלמעלה. זה קשה להם, כיוון שהוא יתברך יחיד ומיוחד אחד האמת. אם כן, איך ייתכן ידיעת השם דרך הפרטים וההשגחה הפרטית, לתת דעתו על עניינים רבים, שהרי זה בחינת ריבוי. It says the philosophers had a problem with God knowing everything, because for them, knowing everything meant that He also had to accept multiplicity. Why? Because there's many, many actions. So if you're going to tell me that He in general knows everything, that they could tolerate to a certain degree. But to come and say that He knows every single detail, that presented a problem for the philosophers. And it didn't matter whether it was a philosopher who was religious or not religious, even Maimonides has this problem. וחז"ל כיוונו לתרץ זה בדיבור אחד ברמם גלוי וידוע לפניי, שאין ידיעתו יתברך כדמיון ידיעת האדם, איזו דבר שדעתו השיג הדבר מתחילה לא ידעו, כשיודע הדבר דעתו מלובשת בידיעה זו מחשבה זו שנותן דעתו להשיגה. וקודם ידיעתו הייתה דעתו פנויה, והרי זה בחינת שינוי והתפעלות. מה שאין כן למעלה ידיעתו שיתברך שיודע כל העולמות, פריטריין, אין העניין שדעתו מתלבשת ומתפסת בזה, אלא דרך גלוי וידוע, שכל גלוי וידוע לפניו יתברך, ממילא. So I read all this very quickly because what he's saying now is, and the answer to their problem is, that the way that He knows is not the way that we know. So going back to our example, when I want to come to know my thoughts, I actually do have to point my awareness and introspect and see what I am thinking. And so at that time, my consciousness is filled, and we call that enclothement, it's filled with my thoughts, and that's what I scrutinize. But God, when He knows, He doesn't need to enclose Himself in new knowledge or in this object that He's going to come to know. Instead, He knows everything all at once. And about that, the prophet says, Isaiah, Ki lo machshavotay machshavotechem. My thoughts are not like your thoughts. And again, the theory of thought hasn't changed very much over the generations. We still use the idea of intention. And intention means that when we come to think of something, let's say I'm thinking now of a rabbit, so if I have a picture of a rabbit in my mind right now, that means that I have intention of a rabbit. But the moment I stop thinking of it, that picture is gone. The rabbit is no longer contained in my thoughts. It's no longer in my consciousness. But by God, there is no such thing. There is no change. And that's what Maimonides calls that by knowing Himself, He knows everything else. Okay, so that is God's omniscience. So now that we've established that God's omniscience is what we think it is, it's just impossible for a human being to fully understand how that works. But why now does it say that the cry came? Where's this cry coming from? If we just said that He doesn't have to add it to His knowledge. So what do you mean a cry came to Him? Where's it coming from? That, God willing, we'll try to answer tomorrow. Sorry for doing it like a cliffhanger, but God willing, we'll get a chance to finish this even tomorrow if all goes well, and we won't have to cry about it. All the best. Bye-bye.